Welcome back to another video about the five kingdoms. This one is about the kingdom fungi. So let me tell you a joke. Do you know why the mushroom went to the party? Well, of course everybody knows he was a fungi. But most people don't know why the fungi left the party. Do you know? He left the party because there wasn't mushroom. Well, moving right along. So here are a few links. I'm just going to give you a little piece of advice. The Brain Pop's great. Watch it, please. Crash Course is a little bit more advanced than maybe you would like. And the Naked Science Scrapbook is excellent. So if you want to choose one to watch, please watch the Naked Science Scrapbook. There's nothing bad in it unless you're talking about fungi and seeing about decomposing and things like that. But it's a great video and it tells you a lot of good things about the kingdom fungi. So first of all, a few characteristics of fungi. Let's go ahead and get it started. First of all, it must live on a food source. It has to live right on it because if it lives close, fungi can't eat. They have to actually absorb their food, so they have to be right on the food source and they can't move. So they can't go and get it. So they must live on a food source. It could be in soil because there's food in there for them. It can be in tissues of other organisms like a parasite type of situation, or it can just be on something that's dead already. They're saprophytes. They're decomposers. That's the way they get their food. And they reproduce with things called spores. And spores are the reproductive cells that fungi use to reproduce. Right above my head, you're going to see a bunch of hyphae, or mycelium, sometimes they're called. Those are the thread-like bodies of the fungus. So, a couple definitions. The spore, that's the reproductive cell for the fungus. All fungi reproduce with spores. When I say all, remember that means like most of them do. There's a handful that don't, but most of them reproduce with spores. Hyphae, those are the thread-like tubes. Those are those little white things. You might call them roots. The things that form the main body of the fungus. What you are actually looking at when you look at a fungus, a mushroom, a shelf fungus, you're looking at the reproductive part of the fungus. So there is one group of fungus called yeast that reproduces by something called budding. And there is a video here for you to watch. Or you can just take my word for it. Basically, budding is a form of reproduction where a new organism forms kind of on the side of the parent and then kind of pops off. So just imagine if I had a little person that would start to emerge right here. Their head would pop out and then their shoulders and their arms, and they'd be standing there and they'd be just a mini copy of me. And then eventually their feet would pop out and they'd jump off and they'd run away. Now humans don't reproduce that way. That's the way that yeast in the fungus group reproduces. And there are other living things that reproduce by budding. But please don't get the thought that little people start jumping out of people's shoulders, because you'd be on the wrong path. But budding is a form of asexual reproduction. If you are studying fungi, you are called a mycologist, and the study of fungus is mycology. Mycology. Groups of fungi, they're grouped based on how they reproduce, or at least their reproductive structures. The first group, called the club fungi, has something called basidium that's on the undersides of the gills. These fungus are the ones you would most likely probably call mushrooms. They are club-shaped structures, and thus they're called club fungus. Now, just so you know, if there's a test or a quiz, then the question might not be which group of fungus has club-shaped structures. It might say, which have the special structures on the underside of its gills called basidium. So it's not always going to have the word club, but basidium is the important word to remember. Second group of fungus is called sac fungi. Some of you are going to recognize this fungus right here. It's a morel. It's one of the examples of a sac fungus. Sac fungus make their spores in something called an ascus. Don't tell us, just ascus. That's how you remember how to pronounce it. And if you look at the word ascus and you look at the word sac, it's the same letters, except there's a U, but it's the same letters. They're just all mixed up. The third group is something called thread-like or zygospore fungus. And basically, they have a whole bunch of hyphae. And at the tips of the hyphae, they have something called a sporangium that carries the spores. And so you can see a few examples of those thread-like or zygospore fungus. Those are the ones that are growing on your foods and on your breads and on other things. The last group is imperfect fungus. They are not imperfect because they don't reproduce. They're imperfect because we as humans have not discovered a way for them to reproduce, or in some cases we found out how they reproduce. It just doesn't fit in one of the other groups, so we keep them in the imperfect group. All fungus, when they start off being put into the imperfect fungus group until some research can be done and they can find out which group then it goes and belongs in. But penicillium, that you can find growing on an orange, or other types of cheese fungus, may never be taken out of the imperfect group. They might be imperfect forever. So there is a group of fungus that I guess we can call relatives. I have to move myself out of the way so that the relatives can be seen. There are basically two different relatives that we're going to look at. The first one is called a lichen. You might recognize this lichen because we just talked about lichen not too long ago when we were studying natural selection. Do you see the creature on this lichen? If you look really closely and you squint your eyes funny and you hold your head at the right angle, then we can all laugh at you because there's nothing there. But what might you think you saw? Maybe a peppered moth? Because that's what we talked about when we talked about the lichens and how they grow on trees and the lichens are able to camouflage on them. So a lichen is just a relative. It's actually a fungus and an algae, or actually an alga, because that's singular for algae, that live together. The relationship is called a mutualistic relationship because they help each other. The protist makes the food by photosynthesis, and the fungus catches and captures the water, and it also anchors the lichen onto the tree or the rock or whatever it's living on. They are one of the strongest known living things because they can break down rocks with their bare anchors. Anyhow, they can break down rocks because they use their anchors to hold on, and that gets into the rock and eventually it starts disintegrating. The second kind of relative, which isn't really a fungus, but it really doesn't belong anywhere else either, is something called the slime mold. And the slime mold has characteristics of both protists and fungi. And so some scientists would say it's a protist, some would say it's a fungi. If they would say it's a protist, they would say it's a protist because it has the ability to move. And fungus don't have the ability to move. And it moves with something called pseudopods, those things that like little blobs of cytoplasm that ooze out a little bit and then pull the rest of it along. Those who would say it's more of a fungi would say, well, it's a decomposer, so it must be a fungus. And it reproduces with spores. So it oozes along the ground until it can't anymore for some reason, whether the water dries up or it gets too dry. And then it pops up some sort of a case with spores in it, and it sends out its spores for reproduction. So is it a fungus? Is it a protist? Let's just say it's a relative of the fungus and maybe a relative of the protists too. So there's the definition of lichen. It's an organism that's made of a fungus and an alga, or could be a cyanobacterium. Those are the blue-green bacteria. It's very similar to an algae or an alga. Now, fungi are extremely important to us. They provide many foods for us, like cheeses. We use yeast in breads. The process that happens is something called fermentation. When you put the yeast in the water and you give it sugar, which is its food, it then produces carbon dioxide and gives off alcohol. That's fermentation. That's basically yeast eating, but it's not eating. Remember, it's absorbing its food. It's taking in its food because fungi do not eat. Fungi absorb their food. They can also be helpful because they are decomposers. They get rid of dead and decaying things in our environment. You can see, and sometimes you might find things like this in the back of your refrigerator. Now you might say, well, but if there were no fungus, that would just be gross. Well, actually it wouldn't, because the living things that had died wouldn't decompose. So they would look just like they did when they were alive if it wasn't for the decomposers, the saprophytes. But that's helpful because they turn the decomposing stuff into soil and they help us to kind of renew everything. They're also helpful in medicine. They make penicillin and other antibiotics, and they're helpful for medications because fungi, when it grows and it has chemicals in it that resist bacteria. There's a few other things. There's something called Mycrazy. And the answer usually to that question is absolutely I am. But beyond that, that helps you just pronounce it. Mycorrhiza is basically where fungus and plant roots kind of intermingle together, and they actually help each other because the fungus helps to absorb water, which then can be taken by the plants, and the plants give a little bit of food in the form of sugar to the fungus. So it's a mutualistic relationship, and they both benefit from it. Also, if there are lichens in an area, they can sense or censor pollution. And so if there are lichens growing there, it's probably a pretty good area. If the lichens start to die off, you might know that the area might have some air pollution or water pollution or something that you might need to look into. There's the Mycorrhiza. It's the network of hyphae and plant roots that help plants absorb water and gives a little bit of food for the fungus. Fungus can also be harmful. We have athlete's foot. That's, of course, right there. That's athlete's foot. You can see there's a little bit there. And when you look at this slide, you'll get to see it a little bit closer. There's ringworm. That's also right up there. I'm backwards. It's way up there, and you can see it looks like a circle. Some people say ringworm. Wait, that's a worm. No, that's a fungus. There's rust, which you might find on your car or other metal things. There's something called Dutch elm disease. You can see over there, there's two trees, one with Dutch elm disease and one that doesn't. Usually it's something that happens on elm trees. That's why it's called Dutch elm disease. And finally, up in the upper corner, you see the apple scab, which is a type of fungus that grows on apples. So it can be harmful as well as helpful. But as in many things, fungus are much more helpful than they are harmful. It's just, the 1% of fungi that give the rest a bad name. A few definitions, which are at the back, and then a few questions for you to answer. And you can either answer them on a sheet of paper, you can answer them in your Schoology, lots of different possibilities of where you might answer these questions. So that's all from this fungi. Talk to you later.